All right. Welcome to Hiding in the Clouds, how attackers can use applications for sustained persistence and how to find it. I'm Mark, and I'm here with Corissa, and we are program managers in the identity division at Microsoft. So we work on Active Directory, or ADFS, as well as Azure Active Directory. And we work on a team that helps customers deploy Azure Active Directory, and we take those learnings and feedbacks from those deployments, and we work it back into the product to make it easier and better for everybody else. So for this talk, Chris, you can go to the next slide, is talking about this thing called application consent and application permissions and things like that, which some people may not be aware of. So first, we want to make sure you understand what do we mean by application consent and really why you should care about this if you haven't started looking at this already. Then we're going to talk about some key permissions you should be looking for in your environment, as well as how to go investigate these consent grants in your environment. And then lastly, we're going to cover some best practices you can do to protect yourself from these application consent type of attacks. So if you haven't started looking at your applications and your data access, you really need to. So on average, there's about 140 apps in an organization, but this number can vary greatly depending on the size of your organization. Chris and I work with some very large and complex customers, and they have thousands and thousands of applications. So 140 is kind of an average number, but it really, you'll know your environment better than anybody else. This could be less than this or much, much larger than this. And 87% of users can consent to applications today. And the act of consenting to an application isn't bad in itself. But as administrators here and defenders here at BSide Charlotte, we want to make sure that we understand what we're allowing people to do and that we're okay with it from an administrative side of the house. Because we want people to be able to do what they need to do their job, but we also want to make sure we're not putting the organization at risk. So the act of consent is not bad itself, and we're going to get into some of this, but we want to make sure we're doing it in a way that we're okay with. And then also 80% of employees are using non-approved work apps. This is the shadow IT type of stuff that's been around for a little bit. Again, this doesn't mean it's malicious. Maybe, for example, that the cloud storage provider that we want our business to use is either OneDrive or Dropbox, and then this other business unit is using Box. And they're not doing it because they're bad. They're just using it because that's what they prefer to use, or they didn't know they should be using something else. So we want to make sure that we have some guardrails around this type of stuff, and we're letting people use those approved apps for work. So from an application consent perspective, if you haven't heard of it or looked into it in Azure AD, that's okay. We're going to cover a bunch of that here today, but you probably have seen this in your day-to-day life as on your cell phone. So let's say you install some new application, and that application lets you put some funny faces and things like that on pictures. So it's going to ask for your access to your camera. It's going to ask for access to your photos. And it's also going to ask for access to your contacts because it wants to be able to send those photos that you just made directly from the app to your friends and family. And you, as the owner of that phone, can make a choice to say, I'm okay with it having access to this, or I'm not. The application Azure AD permissions model works in a very, very similar way. So there's going to be applications that need access to organizational data. That organizational data is going to be accessed through these resource APIs. And in our case here in Azure AD, it's going to usually be going through Microsoft Graph. And that permission that are going to be granted are going to come through this thing called an application consent. And end users can consent to some of these things, or an admin can consent to it. And we'll kind of cover the differences of that here in a little bit. So to kind of align that previous slide to some of the OpenID Connect protocols, like more of an enterprise type of spec, we have a few different pieces. We have that client application, which can be a mobile app, it can be a web app, or it can be something that runs in the background. And this is what's going to be requesting access to data on behalf of that user. Then we have that resource application, which is usually a web API. In our case, like I said, Microsoft Graph, that's going to expose this data or functionality to that client application. And then we have those permissions. This is what that client application is going to be performing on that data that's owned by some sort of resource application. And this picture that you see right here is that application consent dialog box. So here we can see that this application is a Contoso test app. It's trying to read user and shared contacts, shared calendars, and sign in and read that user profile. And as an end user, you can click accept, I consent to this application, or as an admin, you can do some other things as well. But Chris is going to show you a demo of that here in a little bit. But this is that application consent dialog box if you haven't seen it. If you haven't seen it, that's okay. Chris is going to show you a demo of it here in a little bit. So in terms of consent terminology, that consent prompt, that dialog box that we just showed you, is that consent prompt, and it's asking for those types of permissions for the user to consent to that. And the act of saying yes is a consent grant. Now, here's where we go a little bit different from that phone example. Here is with a concept of called admin consent or administrative consent, which is where an administrator is going to consent to that application. And there's a few reasons why you would need to do that. The first reason is maybe this application is asking for a lot of privileges, and we're going to cover permissions and things like that here in a little bit. But let's say this application is a application that's used to enhance your search in SharePoint or in Exchange. So it's going to ask for the ability to read all mailboxes in the organization or read all SharePoint sites in the organization. End users do not have the ability, and we don't want them to have that ability, to say that that is okay for my organization. At that point, for these high permission privileges, we need to get an admin involved to say, we understand what this application is doing and we are okay with it. So they're going to consent to that. So we need someone that has more privileges to say that this high privileged operation is okay for our environment. The second example is that when an admin consents to an application, they're consenting to the application for all of the users in the organization. So a good example of this is the native mail client in iOS. When you go to connect it to your mailbox and Exchange online, you'll get that same type of consent dialog box up. It will show you this is made by Apple. The app is verified, and we're going to cover some of that here in a little bit. And the end user can say, yes, I'm okay with this. They click OK, and the application works. That's fine. But now, as an organization, we can say, you know what, we're okay with this application being used. So I'm going to go in there as an admin and consent to it. So all of my users in my directory can now use this application. So the next person that goes to sign in with the native mail client on iOS, they will not get that consent dialog box because an admin has consented to it for the entire organization. So there's different types of permissions for applications that we're consenting to. The two types here are delegated permissions and application permissions. Delegated permissions is what we want most of our applications to be using. This requires the user to be signed in and present for that application to make those calls on behalf of that user. These are the types of permissions that I just talked about that an end user can consent to, as well as if an admin consents to it because it has higher privileges, or we're going to consent to it for all users in the organization. That's the delegated permissions. Now, the effective permissions of those delegated permissions is where people tend to get a little bit tripped up if they don't understand this correctly. So let's say that application is asking for the ability to do, read all mailboxes or read all SharePoint sites, and we've consented to that as an admin. But the user has the ability to only look at their mailbox or their SharePoint sites. When they use that application, the effective permissions is the intersection of that user's underlying permissions and the permissions that the application has been granted to. So to say that another way, we're not elevating those end users' permissions. They don't get to see all the mailboxes now or all the SharePoint sites because they don't have that ability themselves. So it's the intersection of what that user has access to do and what the application has access to do. Now, this is sometimes referred to as scopes, OAuth 2 permission grants, or app plus user permissions. The second type of permissions here is application permissions. And these are very, very powerful permissions because these applications can run without the user being signed in or present at all. And whatever permissions that we've consented to, that an admin has to consent to for application permissions, that application has the ability to do. So if an application is asking for the ability to read and write to everyone's mailbox or do directory read write all, and an admin consents to it, that application has those permissions and has the ability to do those types of things. And we're going to show you a demo of that later, just to kind of hopefully really hammer that home, that this could be a very, very privileged operation. And if we're not careful to what we're allowing people or applications to do, they may have some adverse effects in our environment. Now, this is sometimes called roles, or app-only permissions. Okay, so I know this has been a lot. So the next slide here is just kind of giving you hopefully a nice recap for you. So delegated permissions is what we want applications to be using. This is going to be those mobile apps, those web apps, or those SPA apps, which are single page applications. End users can consent to it. An administrator can consent to it for all users in their organization. And the effective permissions model is the intersection between what the application has the ability to do and what the end user has the ability to do. But there's nothing in there that we're not elevating the user's permissions to do something they didn't already have access to do. The application permission model, those run without a user being signed in at all. So these are like your service or daemon accounts. Only IT administrators can grant access to applications to do this. So we want to be very, very careful about that. And whatever permissions you grant to an application, that application has the ability to do. So we want to make sure we're very, very careful and clear about what those applications has the ability to do in our environment. And with that, I think Chris is going to do a demo here of the application consent experience.
Yes. All right. So thanks, Mark. So I'm going to do a demo experience as if I am a user and an admin, so you can see what that permission experience is. And so first, I'm going to be signing in as Lisa Smith into the Woodgrove tenant. So I sign in, and it's accessing the Woodgrove shipping application. And there's some permissions that I don't have the rights to yet, so it's saying that approval is required. And you can see in this permission box that you can look into the type of permissions. There's some that are specific for users. There's some that are specific for the applications. And I would need to enter a justification of why I want to request this application. And then I would just hit request approval, and this would be sent off to the admin. Now, if I were actually signed in as an admin, there's a slightly different experience, as Mark was mentioning. So now I'm signed into the Woodgrove tenant as an admin, and go to the link of that same Woodgrove shipping application. And now here you can see that permission is requested to review for your organization. I see that is an unverified application. I'm looking at the permissions that it's asking to do. And then in the end, I can either accept or cancel it. And if I accept it, I'm going to be accepting it on behalf of the entire organization. And then no longer will any of the users receive that pop-up, because now it's registered and good to go. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Mark.
Okay, so what actually happens under the covers when we click yes, consent to this thing? So in Azure AD, there's two areas if you haven't looked at it yet. There's the app registrations and there's the enterprise apps. The app registrations is the definition of the application. So the way to think about this is kind of the back of the house type of configuration of that application. So is this application going to be a single tenant app only used by your company? Is this application going to be a multi-tenant app that can be used by multiple different companies? Is it going to be only for Azure AD users? Is it going to be for also MSA users? This is all the type of configuration that you'll do and you'll set in the app registrations. The enterprise apps has what's called a service principal, and we'll talk about that here in the next slide. But this is very, very important because this is the representation of the application. You can think about this as kind of the front of the house. Do you have to do MFA to actually get into this application? This is who has access to that application. That's all configured there in the enterprise apps. So to make this clear here, an example, let's say I'm tenant one and we make a timekeeping application. Corissa and I make that, and we sell this to other companies. So in our tenant, there will be an app registration for that timekeeping application, but we also use that application as a company. So we will have that as a service principal in the enterprise apps. And when we sell this application to other companies, when they go to add it to their Azure AD tenant, what they will see is a service principal in their tenant. They will not see the app registration. They will only see a service principal. So to make this real, if you check your tenant and you look for Exchange Online or SharePoint or Salesforce or Workday or any of those types of applications, what you will see is a service principal in enterprise apps. You will not see an app registration. But if you were moving like a line of business application that's only going to be used by your company, you're moving that up there, you're going to see a app registration for it, as well as that service principal. And the service principal here is really, really important. So the service principal is really important because this is also the security principal for the application. And this can be granted access to things, as you can see here. So we already talked about the two permissions, the delegated permissions model and the app-only permissions model. But these things can also be on ACLs for Azure Key Vault. Service principals can hold role assignments in Azure. Service principals can hold role assignments in the directory. Service principals can own groups, other applications, and other service principals. So the service principal, you can kind of think of it like a service account, maybe an on-prem Active Directory if you're familiar with that. But this is very, very important because this has access to things in your environment. And we just released last week, actually, in the Azure AD sign-in logs, you will now see all of the sign-ins for things like service principals and managed service identities, which is a type of service principal. And those have access to things. So you can see exactly today in your environment what these things are doing and what they have access to do in your environment. So I know somebody here is probably thinking at this point, they're thinking exactly like Grandpa Simpson, that this cloud is nothing but trouble. I knew it from the beginning. So I have, and now in my tenant, when I go look at this stuff, I have all these mystery applications. I have no idea where they came from. We have a bunch of users assigned to applications. I have no idea how anybody got assigned to these applications. And there's a bunch of permissions that I do not understand what's happening in my environment. And this is all the cloud's fault. And we have some stuff that will make this easier for you. We have some scripts that we'll give you at the end of this talk. You can run it in your environment. We'll cover all that. But I dare you to ask these same questions about your on-prem environment. If you don't have a very good application inventory, which lots of customers do not have, I dare you to ask these same questions about those on-prem apps. Do you know where all those apps have come from? Do you know who has what assignment to what applications? Do you know what permissions these applications need? So this is the point here, is that this is not a unique challenge to the cloud. You probably have this problem already on-prem. You may just not be realizing it. And the reason you want to start looking at this, you can go to the next slide, Corissa, is because we're starting to see some malware campaigns around this. So traditionally from a malware campaign, right, we have this invoice attachment, we have some sort of macro we're trying to get the person to run, and in this COVID-19 type of campaign, we're starting to see these people are, just the utmost scum of the earth. They're trying to impersonate the CDC. They're preying on people's fear, and they're still trying to get people to run these attachments and these macros. And this is the traditional type of phishing that you probably, as administrators and defenders, or even like attackers, internal attackers trying to get people to do stuff. This is the type of thing that you're probably used to seeing. But from an application consent, that's something as a new thing we're starting to see. And you can go to the next slide, Corissa, where we're not seeing this like in effect. The most common types of attacks we still see are going to be the traditional phishing, the traditional password reuse, the traditional like legacy authentication's open, nobody's using MFA, so they're getting password sprayed. But we're starting to see this as an evolved threat, where instead of trying to get you to download that Excel document or run that Word document and run that macro, they want you to consent to an application. So here you can see this Office 365 Access application, and that logo looks kind of familiar, but it's probably not quite right. And we can see that it wants to read your contacts and read your profile. That looks like some applications that I've done before. And if I'm not paying too close attention, it also wants to be able to read all my OneNote notebooks. It also wants to be able to read and write to all my mailbox settings. It has full access to all my stuff. So if I'm not paying attention, I'm granting this permission or this application very powerful permissions to my account. And we've seen a few customers get hit with this type of phishing attack. And this is where we talk about, the title says sustained persistence. Your traditional types of malware tools here aren't going to work because there isn't anything run on the local workstation, right? This is in the service. This application has now requested access to things. It has access to this person's mailbox. So even if you go in and you find this application is bad, and we're going to show you how to do that, and you remove it, you need to do a little more deeping to eradicate this, because if this application had the ability to create mailbox forwarding rules, those forwarding rules are still going to be on those mailboxes even after you removed that application, okay? So we want to make sure, this is why it's really important to understand what people have consented to in the environment, what those permissions that those applications have the ability to do. And when we do find something that's malicious, we are looking in the right places. We're not just running a scan of that local workstation and go, yeah, it looks fine. Oh yeah, we deleted the app. You have to do more than that. You need to be able to look to see what that application had the permissions to do, and did it make any changes in other places like mailbox forwarding rules? Did it make any changes into OneNote? Things like that. Those are all things that are really important that we want to take a look at. Okay, so hopefully at this point, if you didn't know about application consent and you didn't care about it then, you hopefully care about it now. So let's talk about some of those key permissions that you should be looking for in your environment. So this is really for your reference, but any of these really types of highly privileged permissions, we want to make sure we understand. And just because an application is asking for the ability to do mail read write all or directory read write all, or any of these types of permissions that are just very, very privileged, doesn't mean the application is bad. It could just mean a few different things. One, the application might need this. If you have an e-discovery application you're using, it's going to need a lot of permissions in your Exchange Online mail environment to be able to search through things and search through SharePoint and find those types of things for legal discovery. That's okay. The point, though, as defenders and application administrators, we want to make sure we really understand, does that application really need those permissions? And if it's okay, then that's okay. It can do that, but we want to make sure. The other scenario here is that, and we'll talk about this a little bit later as well, is that developers are just kind of lazy and they don't actually sometimes do the work to understand what permissions they need. And this is not a new problem. I'm sure everybody here has had some business unit buy an application and say, please set this up for us. And you get that install guide and it says it needs domain admin, enterprise admin, and scheme admin. And you're like, what in the world is this application doing? And does it really need those application permissions? No, it does not need those directory permissions at all. They just don't know. They didn't do the work to figure out what the permissions need. So you're going to see the same types of thing here. So any of those types of permissions like this, we just want to be really, really careful about what we let them do, because it might have those very privileged permissions and it can do some damage. And we'll show you that here in a demo in a little bit. All right, some other low impact permissions too that you need to think about as administrators is that, this is basic stuff. Any user can see their own email, their profile, and user.read, and that's okay. But we had a customer where some end user wanted to use this like directory application, and the directory application asked for these types of permissions. The end user had the ability to say yes. It went to the consent prompt and said, yes, you can do that. And it went on their normal way. They did their job, what they needed to do. And then 6 months later, one of their executives went to this directory website and saw their internal profile picture, their first name, last name, and email address. And they said, we've been hacked. Well, no, end users have this ability. This is basic stuff that's in the gal, right? Like people's profile picture is in the gal. People's email address is in the gal. Anyone can read and see this type of thing. But if you don't realize that other applications will have this ability to do this, even though this is a low impact permission, you need to understand what they can do in your environment. So when you think about policies, and Chris is going to talk about this a little bit later, these are the things to think about. Are we okay with an end user letting some application, see our profile pictures and see our email addresses? It's not dangerous, but maybe for some customers it is, and other customers it's not. So these are things to go ahead and think about. And now at this point, Chris is going to show you this really cool demo about showing you what application permissions can actually do in your environment.
Yeah, so thanks, Mark. So in the previous demo, you saw that I tried to access a demo that I didn't have rights to. So now we're going to look at what an application that is actually in our environment and the type of permissions it has. So I'm going into the Woodgrove Immunity Passports application, and here inside the portal, I can look at the API permissions that are allowed for it. And if you look through, there's a few concerning things here. One is if you look at the top of the name of the application, there's 3 O's. So that's definitely not how my tenant is spelled. So I should be watching out for those type of misspellings. The second thing to look at is look at how many different types of permissions this application has. There's a ton of application permissions, and you can see there's some delegated permissions as well. And one of the main ones I'm going to point out, as Mark said, is the user read write all. It may not be dangerous, but we should be aware that this application has this because a user does not need to be signed in for the application to change things. And I'm going to illustrate that with using the Graph Explorer, which does have user read write all privileges, and just to show you what that can do. So I'm looking here at Lisa. That was the user profile that I signed in earlier, and I can see her information here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change this to whatever I want. And I'm going to patch it. Okay. I'm going to rerun the query. And now Lisa's profile has Mark Morrow as a display name. So what does that mean for Lisa and her profile? So I'm going to pull up Lisa's profile. And normally it looked like this, right? This is my account where she does all of her self-service management of her passwords and privacy. And so I'm going to refresh it. One more time for good measure. And now Lisa Smith has turned into Mark Morrow. Again, this is just showing like what you can do with that privilege, and that is a very high privilege for an application to have, especially when a user does not even need to be present.
Right. So that's a very hopefully concerning demo. And again, just because it has those permissions doesn't make the application bad. It just has those permissions to do those types of things in your environment. So we want to make sure we understand what those applications are and why they need those types of permissions. So at this point, I'm guessing if you did not know about any of this stuff, you may be a little worried about what's in my environment and how do I like go deal with this. So let's talk about like how you can go investigate these types of things. So the first place here is if you only have a few applications, in the Office 365 portal, you can look for some indicators of compromise. You can go through the Security and Compliance Center, look at those audit logs. If you see anything that says admin consent set to true, that means a global admin had to go in there and approve permissions, okay? So again, those are going to be those very privileged permissions. And if you were an attacker and maybe you tricked a global admin to consent to a lot of permissions, that application now has the ability to do those types of things. So we want to make sure we look at that. You can also see this in the Azure AD portal under the Enterprise Apps Permissions that Corissa showed you, as well as in those audit logs. But I'm guessing that most of you will probably not have a few apps. You will probably have lots of apps. Remember, the average app is like 140 or whatever. You probably have many more than that. So we have a script for you. If you go to ak.ms/get Azure AD permissions, this is a GitHub repository of a script that you can run in PowerShell, and this will dump out all of the applications and their permissions in your directory. This is probably the easiest and fastest way to go ahead and do this. If you also have Microsoft Cloud App Security, which is part of our CASB solution, that can also be used to look for high privilege permissions. So once you run this script, and Chris is going to show you this here in a demo, what should you look for? So first of all, look for anything that has those all principles. This means it's applying to all users in the tenant. So any of those non-Microsoft apps, like Exchange Online is going to have this, SharePoint Online. Those are things that you would expect to have those types of permissions. But any other types of applications, you want to make sure you understand, again, what is this application and why does it need these permissions? Then start looking for any of those permissions that have those from that previous slide. Anything read-write, anything star.all. Those are all types of permissions that we want to make sure we look for. So here in the slide, there's an application called UiPath SPO bot file, and it wants the ability to do files, read, write, all. That may be okay. That may not be okay. I don't know what that UiPath SPO bot is doing, but we want to make sure we understand that as administrators and defenders. A few other things we should be looking for as well. We want to look for those high profile, high impact users. These are those types of users that if someone said, did you see it happen to so-and-so's account? Somebody says, oh no, but they probably don't use the word no. They probably use an adult word, right? Because those are the people that have access to very sensitive data. We want to be very, very sure what those people have consented to. There are targets for types of spear phishing and things like that. So look for those ones. You know who those people are in your environment. Go look in this spreadsheet to see what have they consented to. Then we have the traditional types of, malware types of hiding things. So things that are trying to hide, right? This app is called Email, and it needs file, read, write, all for all principles on Microsoft Graph. That seems kind of suspicious. Apps that have misspelled names here. So this one, we got that driver's edge with the leet speak in there. Chris also showed you that in her sample, we had Woodgrove, but it was spelled with 3 O's instead of the normal 2, trying to blend in. Or just any of those weird hacker sounding names, intelligence. This thing wants data, read, write, all for all principles. Again, very, very privileged. What is this application? Why does it need that? And then some other things to consider here as well. So this is just the general indicators of compromise stuff to look for. This is going to be suspicious activities outside of like normal office hours, deviations from their normal behavior based on, why is this person in one department doing something in some other app they have no business doing. Date and time of applications being created. So we've seen this as well, where the application was created a few days ago and now it's being used. Think of this just like how defenders do this for domain names, right? This domain name was created 3 or 4 days ago. Now we're getting a bunch of suspicious looking emails from it. That's pretty suspicious. Same thing with applications. If we can see the application date time was created a few days ago, looks very suspicious, we want to go ahead and take a look at that as well. And Chris is going to show you the output of this script.
Yes. So if you go ahead and follow the guidance from that GitHub link, you will get and run it in your PowerShell in your environment. You're going to get a CSV file that looks kind of like this. And basically, it's just going to be a bunch of columns. And it's going to show your permission type, object ID, display name. It's also going to show you, like Mark said, like look at the consent type, if it's going to all principals or not, the type permissions it has. And if you're a data nerd like me, then you might want to just like quickly put it into some pivot tables. This way you can quickly see by permission and the name of the application. You can see how many have application permissions or delegated permissions. You can also start filtering out by directory read write all or user read write all, things like that. So I definitely recommend doing this. It's a great tool to learn your environment, very valuable in protecting yourself from these type of consent attacks.
Yeah, so go ahead and run that script. We're continually to make improvements to it. So use that same URL. We'll continue to add things to it. So, okay. So at this point, you've run that script, you've looked at that output, and you find something that does not look great. So how do I start investigating this types of stuff? So first, if it's an Office 365 type of application, so like one of those ones that's maybe made changes to mailbox rules and things like that, you can use the Security and Compliance Council here to search through those logs, and you can look for those indicators of compromise in those keyword settings there. If you know the scope of the attack, so it was just Exchange or it's just OneDrive, selecting that location will cut this way down in terms of search time. You don't have to search for everything in Office 365. So that's a good tip there for you when you're starting to investigate. So you've taken a look there, and now you've confirmed an attack has happened. It's time to start your incident response process. So the first question I want everybody to think about here is, does your IR process cover this scenario of application consent? And if it doesn't, that's okay. This is the time to start thinking about it, to talk about it, to work with that with your different teams, because if you don't realize what's happening with these applications and how those permissions works and what those things can do, your traditional IR process will probably not cover this. And like I said earlier, when you run your tools on the local workstation and you don't see anything, you're not going to see anything because it didn't actually take place on that workstation. There was no macro that ran. All those traditional tools where we work through those types of time-based analysis don't work here on that client because it didn't happen on the client. It happened on the service side. So we want to make sure that our IR process covers this scenario, and the time to start going through this is now, not when you've had an attack. Like, again, this isn't something we're seeing happening all the time, but it's starting to emerge. So this is the time to go build this into your IR process. So what should you do? Again, here, disable that malicious service principal. Service principals are very important here. We want to revoke the consent for those applications. You can revoke any of those role assignments. Remember, service principals can have roles, so maybe the application did that. You can disable the sign-in for this. And then we want to remove any of those persistent mechanisms that the application may have added. Remember, if it adds those mailbox forwarding rules and you don't check for that and you just remove the application, you have not removed the attacker. Those mailbox rules are still going to be forwarding mail and those things that they did. So we want to make sure we're looking into that to make sure we fully remove it. We don't just remove the app or disable the application. We need to go see what they actually changed and remove those types of persistent mechanisms as well. And with that, Corissa is going to cover some best practices that we can do to go forward here.
Yeah, so thanks, Mark. So one of the first best practices that we're recommending to protect yourself from app consent attacks is to set up some policies. And inside the Azure portal, you can decide who can consent to applications within your organization. So as you can see in the screenshot on the left, you have 3 buttons. You can prohibit all your users from consenting to applications whatsoever. You can also allow all your users to consent to applications. Both of these we don't think are the best decisions unless it's very specific to your environment. What we do recommend is the middle one, which is to allow users to consent to apps that are from verified publishers and they're for selected permissions that you decided as an organization are considered low impact and safe. So another option shown on the right-hand side, in the right-hand side screenshot there, is if you have MCAS, which is Microsoft Cloud App Security that Mark mentioned earlier, you can set up app permission policies, which will automatically revoke an app or a user from a specific app based on certain detections in your environment. So the second best practice that we recommend is to use and track risk-based user consent. So what is this step-up consent? When a risky request is detected, the request will be stepped up to require admin approval. So as you saw in my demo, users and admins will see this warning, but the admins will have the ability to approve it on behalf of the entire organization. So when this happens, also an audit event will be logged. And as we all know, like logs are only as useful if we use them and check them and take action on them. So as admins, you want to have a process in place with these requests coming in. Don't just let them hang there. It's important to assign owners to clarify which factors should be considered to grant or deny permissions. And then once that admin grants consent, no other users will see that warning for that particular app, and it will be now in your environment. So number 3 is to detect risky OAuth apps. So now that you've protected yourself from any illicit apps you might encounter in the future, you can't forget about the apps that might already be there. So there is a good, better, best approach to this. But most importantly, we just want you to do something about it and to monitor it on the regular. So the script I showed you, go do that. It's a great place to start. It does require, like I said, a little bit of manual work and looking through the data, but you'll get to know your environment by combing through the apps and the permissions and identifying anything that might look overprivileged or questionable. So better yet, we recommend using Azure Monitor to set up alerts that will automate that process for you. So you can set up notifications that when an OAuth requires super high security permissions or is authorized for a big chunk of users, you'll get notifications and emails for that. And then the ideal option is to do some risky app hunting with a CASB solution, such as MCAS. You can filter and find apps that are potentially very risky or that users consented to not knowing the potential risk. So some of the things you can filter on are high permissions, not common use, or authorizations by external users. And the fourth one is for developers. So developers, check your app. It might be, and it probably is, overprivileged. We're seeing new permissions and we're putting out new permissions all the time here at Microsoft. So it makes it really easy to scope with granular, scope your app to granular permissions. And one of the common things that we see with line of business apps especially is that devs are not following least privilege. So this is by no means a new problem, as you heard Mark mention earlier, but we really want to encourage developers to follow least privilege and only ask for what is necessary. Take a look at the guidance that we put here in the deck. Those are super helpful links to get started. And then in terms of teams, it's becoming more and more popular. We want to make sure that apps can only access the teams they really need. So take a look here at the team specific permissions. We've included a link as well. And last but not least, we highly recommend this developer guidance. It's a identity developer series, but we recommend it for all IT pros and all devs to watch. So you will not regret it. I watched it and you'll learn so much from this video series. I don't have a developer background, but I learned a ton about API calls, to Microsoft Graph, permissions and scopes, access tokens, client credential flow. All of this is super valuable, and we recommend it both to IT pros and devs alike. And finally, make sure to report suspicious apps back to us. You can report them directly on the consent screen, as you see in the screenshot here, or using MCAS. All right, so let's recap with some go-dos. So do inventory your applications and their permissions. It's always important to know what's in your environment, so this is not a waste of time, and we've shown you some great tools to do so. Automate threat response where possible. Educate your org on these consent attacks. As Mark mentioned, this is not something that we're seeing a ton of yet, but it is starting to happen, and we want people to be aware of it. And then lastly, educate your developers to make sure they follow the best security practices. We will leave you with some helpful resources and then before we open up to questions and answers. So thank you for attending B-Sides, and we really look forward to your feedback on our session.